The sun blazed overhead, casting long shadows across the arid plains of Persia as an unnamed Macedonian soldier adjusted the heavy bronze helmet pressing against his brow. Around him, the air vibrated with the clatter of shields and the rhythmic thud of thousands of sandaled feet marching in unison. This wasn't just another campaign. It was another step into the unknown, another day in the relentless march of Alexander the Great's army. Most histories remember Alexander as the brilliant strategist, the conqueror who carved an empire stretching from Greece to India. But what about the men who followed him, the ordinary soldiers who bore the weight of his ambition on their shoulders, who slept on rocky ground, and who whispered around campfires about homes they might never see again? Their stories are the untold heartbeat of history, buried beneath the dust of time. Imagine standing in that soldier's sandals for just a moment. The leather straps of your armor chafe against your skin. The weight of your spear feels heavier with each mile, and the distant horizon holds both promise and peril. You're not just part of an army, you're part of a living, breathing machine of conquest, yet your name might never be written down. For every grand speech Alexander gave, there were countless silent moments of exhaustion, courage, and doubt among his ranks. What did those soldiers see? What did they fear? What kept them marching forward when every muscle screamed to stop? These are the questions that history often overlooks, but they're the very questions that bring the past to life. Today, we're stepping off the well-trodden path of kings and battles to walk alongside Alexander's soldiers. Through fragments of ancient letters, the scars on unearthed armor, and the echoes of their voices in long-forgotten accounts, we'll piece together their world. This isn't just a story of conquest, it's a story of human endurance, of the bond between comrades, and of the price paid for glory. By the end of this journey, you'll see Alexander's campaigns through the eyes of the men who lived them, men whose footsteps still whisper to us across 2,000 years. So let's begin where they did, on the road under the same unforgiving sun, with the weight of history pressing down on every step. The life of a Macedonian soldier was anything but glamorous. Before dawn broke, they were already packing up their meager belongings, rolling thin blankets and strapping on armor that had seen better days. Each morning began with the same routine, checking weapons, tightening sandals, and swallowing a few bites of hard bread before falling into formation. Historian Arrian wrote that Alexander's men could march 30 miles in a single day, carrying nearly 50 pounds of gear under the scorching sun or through freezing mountain passes. Their sandals wore thin on rocky terrain, their muscles ached, and blisters became as familiar as the faces of the men marching beside them. Training was brutal from the start. New recruits, often teenagers, learned to wield the sarissa, a spear so long it took 2 hands to control while standing shoulder to shoulder in the phalanx. One misstep could break the formation, leaving the entire unit vulnerable. Discipline was ironclad. Soldiers drilled for hours, mastering the art of moving as one entity, their shields interlocking like the scales of a serpent. Yet despite the grueling conditions, loyalty ran deep. These men weren't just fighting for Alexander's dream, they were fighting for each other. The phalanx was a brotherhood bound by trust and the unspoken rule that no one got left behind. At night, campfires flickered across makeshift settlements as soldiers mended torn cloaks, sharpened blades, and traded stories of home. Some whispered about olive groves in Macedonia or the laughter of children they hadn't seen in years. Others stared into the flames, too exhausted to speak. The reality of conquest wasn't just battles and glory. It was blistered feet, empty stomachs, and the quiet dread of never returning. But amid the exhaustion, there was also resilience. These men endured because they believed in something greater than themselves, whether it was honor, adventure, or simply the man leading them. And that raises the question: what kept them going when every muscle screamed to quit? What made them push forward into lands no Greek had ever seen? The answer lies not in the speeches of kings, but in the unbreakable spirit of ordinary men. Next, we'll uncover the hidden motivations that fueled Alexander's army, from promises of wealth to the unshakable bonds forged in the dust of countless battlefields. Alexander's soldiers didn't follow him blindly, they followed him because he gave them reasons to. The first was sheer charisma. Ancient historians like Plutarch describe him as magnetic, a leader who could lock eyes with a weary soldier and make him feel like the most important man in the army. He didn't just command from the rear, he fought in the front lines, sharing their dangers. After the brutal battle of the Granicus, where Alexander nearly died from a Persian axe blow to the head, his men saw the blood matted in his hair and the determination in his eyes. That kind of courage was contagious. When a king risks his life alongside you, it's harder to complain about sore feet or empty stomachs. But charisma alone couldn't sustain an army for 11 years and 11,000 miles. There was also the lure of wealth. Persia's treasures were legendary, and Alexander made sure his men knew they'd share in the spoils. After the sack of Persepolis, common soldiers walked away with enough gold to buy farms back home. For many, this was life-changing, a chance to escape poverty forever. Yet Alexander was shrewd. He doled out rewards strategically, creating a cycle of anticipation. A victory today might mean a bonus tomorrow, and that hope kept men marching even when the next payday felt impossibly far away. Unity was another weapon in Alexander's arsenal. His army was a patchwork of Macedonians, Greeks, Thracians, and later even Persians. Instead of letting divisions weaken them, he turned diversity into strength. He adopted Persian dress, encouraged intermarriage, and promoted based on merit, not birth. A Macedonian noble and a Persian horseman might dine together, bound by shared campaigns rather than separated by old prejudices. This wasn't just tolerance, it was practical genius. Soldiers who felt valued were less likely to desert, yet loyalty had its limits. The mutiny at Opis in 324 BC laid bare the army's fractures. Exhausted veterans, sick of endless marching, demanded to go home. Alexander's response, a masterclass in psychological warfare. He publicly shamed them, listing every sacrifice he'd made, then replaced them with Persian recruits. The message was clear: you're replaceable. Within days, the men begged forgiveness. It was a reminder that for all his generosity, Alexander ruled through a mix of inspiration and intimidation. Behind the gold and the glory, there was an unspoken contract. Alexander asked for everything: your strength, your endurance, even your life, but in return, he offered a share in something immortal. To march with him was to become part of history. That's why, even when the rivers ran dry and the rations ran low, his soldiers found ways to keep going. They weren't just fighting for a king, they were fighting for the legend they helped build, and that's a force more powerful than any spear. Victory after victory, mile after mile, Alexander's army carved its name into history, but the cost was etched just as deeply into the minds of the men who fought. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC was a triumph, a masterpiece of tactics that shattered Persian power. Yet for the soldiers standing knee-deep in mud and blood when the dust settled, triumph tasted bittersweet. The adrenaline of battle always faded, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion no amount of plunder could fill. These weren't just warriors, they were human beings, and after years of campaigning, the psychological weight of constant warfare began to crack even the toughest spirits. Leap became a battleground of its own. Veterans would startle awake at the slightest sound, their hands clutching weapons long after the fighting ended. The historian Curtius wrote of men haunted by phantom cries, the screams of fallen comrades, the wails of enemies they'd killed. Modern soldiers call it post-traumatic stress, but Alexander's men had no name for it. They only knew the creeping dread that followed them like a shadow, even in moments of peace. The farther they marched into unfamiliar lands across the Hindu Kush, into the Indus Valley, the more the world felt alien, hostile. Every strange bird call could be a hidden archer. Every rustle in the tall grass might hide a war elephant. Fear wasn't just a reaction, it became a constant companion. And then there were the wounds no bandage could mend. A soldier might laugh with his brothers around a fire, but his eyes would drift to the empty space where a friend once sat. Letters from home, when they arrived at all, were bittersweet reminders of lives moving on without them. One fragment of a Macedonian soldier's letter, preserved on papyrus, reads simply, "Mother, do not weep for me." But if you could send news of the olive harvest, it would be a kindness. Beneath the stoic words, you can almost hear the loneliness. The army's greatest strength, its relentless momentum, also became its cruelest burden. There was no time to grieve, no season of rest. After Gaugamela came the Gedrosian desert, where thirst drove men to drink from puddles of their own urine. The historian Arrian describes soldiers so exhausted they collapsed mid-march, their bodies left where they fell. These weren't just physical breakdowns, they were the final surrender of minds pushed beyond breaking point. Yet somehow these men found ways to endure. They leaned on each other, sharing rations with those too weak to walk. They turned superstition into solace, reading omens in the flight of birds or the patterns of campfire smoke. And when the march resumed, they shouldered their spears once more, not for glory, but because the man beside them did the same. Their resilience wasn't born of mythic heroism, but of the quiet, stubborn will to survive another day. Understanding this hidden toll changes how we see Alexander's conquests. Behind every triumphant charge were trembling hands and sleepless nights. Beneath every victory lay 1,000 private battles. So how did soldiers cope with such unrelenting strain? The answers lie in the fragile, extraordinary ways humans preserve their humanity, even in the crucible of war. In the face of unrelenting hardship, Alexander's soldiers clung to two lifelines: each other and the unseen forces they believed guided their fate. Brotherhood wasn't just a word in the ranks, it was a survival tactic. Men who shared the same tent became closer than family, their bonds forged in the quiet moments between battles, mending each other's wounds, dividing the last handful of grain, or trading stories of home under the stars. These weren't mere friendships, they were unspoken pacts. A soldier knew his shield mate would stand firm beside him, even when terror threatened to unravel the line. Historians recount how veterans, decades later, could still recall the names of fallen comrades with the same clarity as their own siblings. That loyalty was their armor against despair. Superstition wove its way through camp life like an invisible thread. Before a battle, men scrutinized the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals for signs of divine favor. A hawk circling clockwise might signal victory. A stumble on the march could send whispers of doom through the ranks. Alexander himself played into these beliefs, consulting oracles and attributing his survival in battle to the intervention of gods like Zeus Ammon. For the common soldier, these rituals weren't just tradition. They were a way to impose order on chaos. If the gods could be persuaded, perhaps the randomness of death might be softened. Religion offered another kind of solace. Soldiers carried small amulets, a carved figure of Heracles for strength, a scrap of parchment with a prayer to Ares for courage. Festivals honoring the gods became rare oases of normalcy, where men could drink, laugh, and forget, if only for a night. The historian Diodorus describes how Alexander's army celebrated the Dionysia in the Hindu Kush, draping vines over their spears and dancing in a fleeting echo of home. These moments of shared faith and festivity were lifelines, reminders that they were more than just instruments of conquest. Yet the deeper the army marched into foreign lands, the more these bonds were tested. Strange customs, unfamiliar languages, and the sheer exhaustion of endless campaigning strained even the tightest friendships. Men who had once shared their last crust of bread now bickered over loot or eyed each other with suspicion. The very superstitions that once comforted them could turn sinister. Was that sudden storm a sign of divine wrath? Was the fever spreading through camp punishment for some unseen offense? The resilience of Alexander's army wasn't just in their muscles or their spears. It was in their ability to find light in the darkness, to create meaning where there was none. They endured not because they were fearless, but because they refused to let fear be the last word. And as the landscape grew stranger and the marches longer, those fragile threads of brotherhood and belief would stretch to their limits, but they would also prove stronger than anyone expected. The first glimpse of Egypt's pyramids rising from the desert sands left Alexander's soldiers speechless. These were men who had grown up hearing myths of faraway lands, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality, monuments so colossal they seemed carved by giants. The local priests, clad in linen robes adorned with cryptic symbols, spoke of pharaohs who had ruled 1,000 years before Athens was even a city. For Macedonian soldiers raised on tales of Greek heroes, the weight of Egypt's antiquity was humbling. Some knelt in the shadow of the Sphinx, tracing their fingers over weathered hieroglyphs as if touching the past itself. Others exchanged wary glances, unsettled by temples where gods had animal heads, and the air smelled of incense they couldn't name. This wasn't just conquest, it was collision, two worlds meeting, neither fully understanding the other. Cultural shock rippled through the ranks with each new frontier. In Persia, soldiers gaped at sprawling palaces where ceilings dripped with gold and gardens bloomed in the heart of deserts. They marveled at baths with hot water piped through walls, a luxury unimaginable in their mountain villages. But fascination often tipped into unease. Persian nobles prostrated themselves before Alexander, pressing their faces to the ground, a gesture that made proud Macedonians bristle. To them, such deference smacked of servility, yet Alexander saw opportunity. He adopted Persian dress, shocking his men by appearing in a flowing robe and sash. Whispers spread, had their king gone native? Was he forgetting who'd brought him this far? The tension simmered, a reminder that conquest wasn't just about land, it was about identity. India shattered every expectation. When scouts reported elephants armored in bronze plates, veterans scoffed until they faced those beasts in battle, their trumpeting shaking the earth. The jungles teemed with creatures straight from nightmares, snakes as thick as a man's thigh, monkeys that shrieked from treetops like vengeful spirits. One soldier's letter home, preserved on a scrap of papyrus, describes a river fish, larger than a horse, that dragged a comrade underwater. These weren't just geographical discoveries, they were psychological upheavals. The world, it turned out, was vaster and stranger than any Greek map had hinted. Yet amid the alien landscapes, moments of unexpected connection flickered. In the Hindu Kush, a Macedonian blacksmith traded his dagger for a local artisan's wool cloak, both men laughing as they pantomimed their barter. Near the Indus, soldiers shared a campfire with Indian mercenaries, passing around a clay vessel of spiced wine. No one understood the words, but the clinking of cups needed no translation. these fragments of shared humanity were lifelines in a world growing ever more unfamiliar. But adaptation had its limits. When Alexander ordered his men to kneel before him in the Persian style, the backlash was instant. Veterans spat on the ground, declaring they'd bow only to gods. The clash wasn't just over protocol, it was a crisis of belonging. How much of the old world should they carry forward? How much of the new could they stomach? Every conquered city forced them to confront these questions anew, stretching their sense of self until it threatened to snap. The greatest irony of their journey was this: the farther they marched, the smaller Greece seemed. The gods of Olympus, the laws of Lycurgus, the very definition of what it meant to be civilized, all were called into question under foreign skies. And as the army turned toward home, weighed down with silks and scars and stories no one back home would believe, they carried something invisible but indelible: the dawning realization that the world was wider, and their place in it far more fragile than they'd ever imagined. Keeping an army of 40,000 men fed across thousands of miles wasn't just a challenge, it was a daily miracle. Picture the sheer scale. Every morning, the Macedonian ranks needed enough grain to fill multiple cargo ships, enough water to drain a small lake, and enough firewood to darken the sky with smoke. In fertile lands like the Nile Delta, local villages could provide supplies, but in the scorching Diadocchi desert or the icy Hindu Kush, survival hinged on meticulous planning and brutal improvisation. Alexander's quartermasters became unsung heroes, calculating rations down to the ounce. A single day's miscalculation meant empty stomachs, and empty stomachs meant mutiny. Foraging was a constant gamble. Scouts fanned out ahead of the main column, scanning for orchards, granaries, or streams. When they found a ripe wheat field, soldiers descended like locusts, stuffing sacks with whatever they could carry. But hostile territories offered no such generosity. After the burning of Persepolis, entire regions turned against them, hiding food in underground caches or poisoning wells. Ancient accounts tell of troops gnawing on leather straps or boiling saddlebags for traces of nutrition. The line between sustenance and starvation was razor thin. Alexander's brilliance lay in adaptation. He repurposed Persian supply networks, commandeering their storerooms and roads. In one audacious move, he ordered ships disassembled in Phoenicia, hauled overland in pieces, and rebuilt to cross the Indus, a floating larder trailing his army. Archaeologists have uncovered campsites with animal bones split lengthwise, evidence of every scrap of marrow being extracted. They've found grinding stones worn smooth from endless use, and clay tablets listing rations in precise Greek script, 2 cups of barley per man, half that for auxiliaries. Yet no system was foolproof. When supply lines snapped, desperation took over. During the march through Diadocchi, pack animals collapsed, forcing men to carry grain sacks themselves until they too dropped. The historian Strabo wrote of soldiers lighting signal fires to guide stragglers only to watch those flames attract scavengers instead. And where hunger went, sickness followed. Dysentery from contaminated water, scurvy from lack of fruit, and fevers bred in crowded camps became silent killers. A soldier might survive a Persian arrow only to succumb to a fever weeks later, his body too weakened by months of scant rations to fight back. These weren't just logistical hurdles, they were tests of human ingenuity. Every meal was a victory, every full water skin a triumph. And as the army pressed onward, their bodies growing leaner but their resolve hardening, another invisible enemy gathered strength, one no spear or shield could fend off. Disease lurked in the shadows of every camp, waiting to strike where blades could not. Disease stalked Alexander's army like an invisible enemy, claiming more lives than any Persian sword. The historian Quintus Curtius paints a grim picture. men collapsing mid-march with their bowels turning to water, their skin burning with fevers no herb could cool. Dysentery spread through crowded camps like wildfire, turning the ground between tents into a foul slurry. In the sweltering Indus Valley, mosquito-borne illnesses struck down veterans who'd survived a dozen battles. There were no microscopes to reveal the real killers, just superstition and desperate remedies. Soldiers clutched amulets against bad air, while physicians bled patients with rusty lancets, believing imbalance in bodily humors caused disease. Medical knowledge was a patchwork of tradition and trial. The Greeks understood wound care better than most. Doctors cleaned injuries with vinegar and wine, knowing these liquids prevented festering, though they couldn't explain why. Splints made from woven reeds stabilized broken bones, and opium poppy extract dulled the worst pain. But against infections raging inside the body, they were powerless. A spear thrust to the gut was often a death sentence, the victim lingering for days in agony as peritonitis set in. Archaeologists examining Macedonian burial sites find skeletons with neatly healed sword fractures alongside others showing telltale pitting, evidence of chronic infections that slowly ate away at the bone. Alexander himself received royal treatment when wounded. After the arrow that pierced his lung at Malea, physicians kept him in a sterile tent with fresh bandages changed hourly. The historian Arrian notes they sterilized instruments in boiling water, an accidental benefit of their belief that heat drove out evil spirits. Common soldiers had no such luxury. A wounded infantryman might lie on the bare earth, his only pillow a bundled cloak, while camp followers tried to staunch his bleeding with ashes or spiderwebs. The luckiest were evacuated on mule-drawn litters. The rest depended on comrades who carried them piggyback until they either recovered or died. Yet amid the suffering, glimmers of innovation emerged. Field hospitals, an idea Alexander borrowed from the Persians, allowed surgeons to operate closer to battle lines. Herbal poultices of honey and myrrh, now known to have antibacterial properties, saved countless limbs from gangrene. And the army's sheer mobility became its own defense. Marching away from marshy areas often broke the cycle of malaria, even if no one understood the connection to mosquitoes. The cruelest irony, many who survived combat only to fall ill later were left behind in makeshift infirmaries as the army marched on. Their names rarely made it into the chronicles, just another anonymous cost of building an empire. But their absence was felt in the thinning ranks, the quieter campfires, and the hollow looks of friends who'd promised to meet again in Macedonia. Disease didn't just kill individuals, it eroded the army's spirit, one feverish whisper at a time. This hidden toll reshaped the campaign in ways tactics alone never could. A force that dwindled from sickness couldn't hold conquered lands, no matter how brilliant its general. And as Alexander pushed deeper into India, his men's resilience, already stretched thin by years of marching, would face its ultimate test not from enemy spears, but from the monsoon rains brewing on the horizon. At Issus, the air tasted of iron and sweat as the Macedonian phalanx locked shields against the roaring Persian tide. A veteran later recalled the sound, not the noble clash of bronze in poets' songs, but a sickening crunch of spears punching through flesh, the wet thud of bodies hitting dirt. The soldier's world shrank to the few feet around him, the stench of the man beside him vomiting in terror, the way his own fingers slipped on the sariss's shaft as blood soaked the linen grip. When Darius' royal charioteers charged, their scythed wheels whirring like harvest blades, the line buckled. Someone screamed to hold formation, but orders dissolved into chaos. Later, survivors would speak of fighting knee-deep in the Pinarus River, the water swirling pink as wounded men thrashed like netted fish. Victory came not from grand strategy, but from the sheer stubbornness of infantry who refused to break. even when their spears shattered and they grappled with daggers in the mud. Hyphasis was worse. Elephants. No amount of drill prepared you for those mountains of muscle and rage. Their screams alone could unravel a man's courage before the first arrow flew. A grizzled Diadocchi's leader of 10 described the horror of watching his mate get snatched up in a trunk and dashed against rocks like a child's doll. The beast's armored hides turned spear thrusts into pinpricks, their tusks gored horses mid-gallop. The riverbank became a churn of corpses and panicking cavalry. Yet amid the carnage, tiny moments of clarity surfaced. A comrade hauling you back from trampling feet, the surreal sight of an Indian archer pausing to wring out his soaked turban before knocking another arrow. War wasn't a single wave of violence, it was 1,000 private struggles, each man fighting his own battle within the maelstrom. The noise never left you. Even years later, veterans would flinch at the clatter of a dropped pot, their ears still ringing with the phantom din of clashing armies. What historians neatly call tactical maneuvers felt nothing like diagrams on a sand table. It was elbows and teeth and the acrid tang of piss when death loomed close enough to smell its breath. Strangest of all, the laughter. Men cracked jokes mid-charge, not from bravery, but because the absurdity of survival demanded it. One soldier's graffiti scratched onto a Babylonian tablet reads, "Fought the Persians, won, still don't know how." And then there were the enemies, not faceless hordes, but men just as terrified and bewildered. The Persian infantryman bracing his wicker shield as the phalanx advanced like a bronze-plated nightmare. The Indian mercenary who paused to help a wounded Macedonian drink before vanishing back into the fray. These weren't just opponents, they were reflections in a distorted mirror, each side convinced the other were the monsters. Which makes you wonder, when the dust settled and the adrenaline faded, what did they see when they looked at us? To the Macedonian soldiers marching into Persia, the enemy was at first just a blur of unfamiliar colors and terrifying sounds. The thunder of chariot wheels, the eerie wail of war horns unlike anything heard in Greece. But as battles turned into occupations, that faceless terror gave way to grudging respect. The Persian infantry, with their wicker shields and short spears, might have seemed inferior at first glance. Yet veterans quickly learned these men could hold a line with ferocious discipline, their archers raining down arrows in such thick volleys they blotted out the sun. One Macedonian cavalryman's account, preserved on a scrap of papyrus, describes a Persian noble who stood his ground alone against 3 attackers, his sword flashing until the last breath. "We buried him with honors," the soldier wrote, "for courage knows no borders. India shattered every expectation. Where the Persians fought in orderly ranks, Indian warriors seemed to move like a force of nature elephants crashing through formations, their tusks draped in chains that whipped like deadly flails." Macedonian spearmen, trained to face human opponents, found themselves stabbing at leathery hides while mahouts perched high above hurled javelins with terrifying precision. Yet even here, moments of unexpected humanity pierced the chaos. After the Battle of Hyphasis, Alexander's men discovered wounded Indian soldiers sharing waterskins with their Macedonian counterparts in the reeds by the riverbank. An uneasy truce born of mutual exhaustion, perhaps, but it hinted at something deeper, the shared language of suffering that transcended the roar of battle. The line between enemy and fellow soldier blurred in strange ways. Persian recruits, once adversaries, now marched beside Macedonians in hybrid units. Indian medics, whose knowledge of herbs surpassed Greek physicians, treated infections with poultices that smelled of turmeric and ginger. These weren't just tactical alliances, they were quiet revolutions in how men saw each other. When a Macedonian veteran taught a Persian horseman how to wield a sarissa, or an Indian scout explained how to read monsoon clouds, old prejudices crumbled like sun-baked mud bricks. Yet for every moment of camaraderie, there were flashes of visceral horror. The same soldiers who shared rations with surrendered Persians at Susa would later recount the nightmares that came after witnessing their enemies' war. Elephants trample children in besieged cities. War demanded compartmentalization, the ability to see a man as both a worthy opponent and a nameless casualty in the morning's tally. This duality haunted the ranks. How could they toast with Persian nobles one night, then cut down their kinsmen the next? And then there was Alexander, straddling both worlds with increasing audacity. His adoption of Persian dress, the fluttering ribbons, the striped trousers, made his Macedonian officers scowl. When he began appointing Persian nobles to high ranks, veterans muttered about betrayal. The very men who'd followed him to the ends of the earth now watched as their king seemed to dissolve before their eyes, his identity as fluid as the borders of his empire. If the enemy was becoming a brother, what did that make them? The question gnawed at the army's cohesion, a splinter working its way deeper with each new compromise. The truth was, after years of conquest, the lines had blurred beyond recognition. The Persians they'd once demonized now guarded their supply trains. The Indian warriors who terrified them at Hyphasis were teaching them how to forge monsoon-proof tents. And Alexander, the man who'd united them under the banner of Greek superiority, now seemed determined to erase the very distinctions they'd fought to uphold. In the end, the greatest battle wasn't against foreign armies. It was against the creeping realization that the world was more complicated than their spears could carve into submission. The first time Alexander strode into camp wearing Persian robes, a stunned silence fell over the Macedonian ranks. The knee-length tunic of white linen, the purple sash at his waist, these weren't just clothes. They were a slap in the face to every soldier who'd bled for him. The men who'd shivered in threadbare cloaks crossing the Hindu Kush now watched their king drape himself in the finery of the very people they'd fought for years. Whispers spread like wildfire through the tents that night. Had the conqueror become the conquered? Was this the same Alexander who'd sworn to bring Greek glory to the barbarians? Prostration was the final straw, when Alexander demanded his generals kneel and press their foreheads to the ground. The Persian ritual of obeisance called proskynesis, even his most loyal commanders balked. To proud Macedonians, such groveling was for slaves and gods, not free men. The historian Arrian recounts how veteran officer Cletus publicly mocked the ceremony, drunkenly shouting that Alexander's Persian flatterers could kiss his Macedonian ass. The king's response, a rage so violent he speared Cletus through the chest during a feast, an act he'd weep over for days but never truly undo. That moment laid bare a truth the army couldn't ignore. Their leader was changing, and not in ways they understood. The rank and file saw the danger before the historians did. Persian nobles now dined at Alexander's table, while Macedonian veterans stood guard outside. Royal pages who'd once been Greek boys of good family were replaced by eunuchs from Susa. Worse yet, the king began appointing Persian satraps to govern lands Macedonian blood had won. Each concession felt like a betrayal to men who'd left pieces of themselves on battlefields from Gaugamela to Hyphasis. Why had they marched through deserts and frozen passes, if not to see their own people elevated? Yet Alexander wasn't just indulging in foreign luxuries. He was playing a desperate game of imperial chess. The Persian Empire couldn't be ruled without Persian cooperation. By adopting local customs, he hoped to stitch his fractured conquests into something lasting. But to his homesick soldiers, every ribbon in his hair, every Persian word on his lips, was another step away from the shared identity that had held them together. The very traits that made Alexander brilliant, his adaptability, His vision of a blended world were the ones that alienated the men who'd made his dreams possible. The breaking point came in Opis. When Alexander announced he was sending the oldest veterans home, the camp erupted not in gratitude but in fury. These weren't just soldiers demanding back pay, they were comrades who'd carried him through a decade of hell, now being cast aside like dulled blades. The king's solution, a chilling display of power. He gave their commands to Persian recruits, parading them in Macedonian armor as if to say, "You are replaceable." The veterans, shattered, begged forgiveness within days, but the damage was done. The unspoken contract between king and soldier, the belief that their suffering meant something, had frayed beyond repair. What the army couldn't see was the loneliness driving Alexander's transformation. The farther he marched from Macedonia, the more he realized no one, not even his closest friends, could truly follow where his ambitions led. The soldiers wanted to go home. Alexander was trying to build one, and in that irreconcilable gap, the greatest fighting force the ancient world had ever known began to unravel. The Hyphasis River glinted under the Indian sun like a serpent of molten silver, its far bank lost in haze. That distant shoreline might as well have been the edge of the world for Alexander's men, because when their king ordered them to cross it, something inside them snapped. Veterans who'd marched through blizzards and sandstorms now planted their spears in the mud and refused to take another step. One grizzled officer, Cohen, spoke for them all when he said, "Our bodies are worn down, our spirits broken." The men long for parents, wives, children, even just to see their native soil before they die. The words hung in the humid air like an indictment. This wasn't just exhaustion, it was the collapse of faith. 11 years of unbroken campaigning had hollowed the army out. The same soldiers who'd cheered at Gaugamela now stared at their king with empty eyes. India's jungles had stolen the last of their strength. Monsoon rains turned armor into rusted prisons, while dysentery left men skeletal beneath their breastplates. Rumors swirled of kingdoms beyond the Hyphasis with armies larger than grains of sand. Even Alexander's most loyal commanders exchanged uneasy glances. How much further could flesh and blood be pushed? The mutiny unfolded with eerie calm. No shouted threats, no drawn swords, just thousands of men standing silent in the downpour, their stillness more terrifying than any revolt. Ancient sources describe Alexander retreating to his tent for 3 days like Achilles at Troy, waiting for his army to repent. When they didn't, he emerged with a masterstroke of psychological theater. He ordered altars built on the riverbank monuments to mark how far he'd come. The message was clear: history would remember this as his choice, not their defiance. Yet the cracks kept spreading. At Opis months later, when Alexander announced Persian recruits would replace Macedonian veterans, the camp erupted. Men tore their cloaks in grief, shouting that after all they'd endured, they deserved better than to be discarded like old sandals. The king's response, a chilling purge of perceived ringleaders, followed by a feast where Persians and Macedonians were forced to share couches. It was reconciliation at sword point, a hollow pantomime of unity that fooled no one. What Alexander failed to grasp was that his men weren't just physically spent, they'd lost the thread of their own story. The war had become endless, the enemies faceless, the rewards meaningless next to the ache for home. No amount of plundered gold could compensate for the gradual erosion of who they'd once been. And so, at the Hyphasis and Opis, the army did what no foreign force had ever managed. It stopped the unconquerable conqueror. Not with spears, but with the quiet, terrible power of collective refusal. This was the paradox of Alexander's leadership. The same charisma that had carried them to the ends of the earth now worked against him. His soldiers had believed so utterly in his vision that when they finally saw its cost, when they realized home might forever lie beyond their reach, their disillusionment cut deeper than any betrayal. The king who'd once inspired them to cross frozen mountains now stood alone on the riverbank, staring at waters he couldn't command his own men to cross. The greatest army of antiquity had finally found its limit, not in battle but in the unyielding weight of human longing. Alexander knew the hearts of his men like a musician knows his instrument, when to pluck their pride, when to soothe their fears, and when to strike a note so sharp it left them trembling. His speeches before battle weren't just orders, they were performances crafted to turn exhaustion into fury, doubt into devotion. At the Granicus River, with Persian cavalry massing on the far bank, he didn't talk of tactics. He reminded his men that these were the same Persians who'd burned Athens a century earlier, the same ones who'd sent chains to enslave Greek mothers. "Will you let them do it again?" he roared. By the time he finished, soldiers were hacking at the river's edge with their swords, desperate to reach the enemy. But inspiration alone couldn't hold an empire together. Alexander's other tool was terror, wielded with surgical precision. When a group of recruits deserted during the Sogdian campaign, he didn't just execute them, he had their bodies staked along the road as a warning. The historian Curtius describes how one officer, Philotas, was accused of conspiracy and tortured for days before being crushed under rocks. His father, Parmenion, a general who'd served Alexander's father for decades, was assassinated without trial. These weren't just punishments, they were calculated displays meant to etch a single lesson into every soldier's mind. Loyalty wasn't optional, yet for every act of brutality, there were gestures of astonishing generosity. After the siege of Tyre, Alexander distributed so much gold that veterans used their helmets as makeshift wheelbarrows to haul their shares. He memorized the names of common soldiers' children, asking after them years later. When a wounded infantryman confessed he'd sold his ancestral farm to join the campaign, Alexander bought it back for him, then gifted him the deeds to his neighbor's land as a bonus. These moments created a paradox. The same man who'd impaled dissenters could weep over a fallen comrade's body, cradling him like a brother. The genius and the cruelty of Alexander's leadership lay in its unpredictability. Men never knew whether the next moment would bring a golden goblet pressed into their hands or a spear pointed at their throat. This kept them perpetually off balance, desperate to please yet terrified to misstep. It also bred a peculiar kind of love-hate devotion. Soldiers might grumble about his Persian robes or his temper, but let an outsider criticize him, and they'd leap to his defense like wolves protecting their alpha. And then, in Babylon's sweltering summer of 323 BC, the music stopped. The king who'd survived battlefield arrows, assassins' poisons, and Himalayan blizzards lay shivering with fever. As word spread through the camp, hardened veterans collapsed like children, clutching at their beards and wailing. Persian nobles tore their garments in the Eastern tradition, while Macedonian officers stood mute, their faces ashen. The man who'd been their compass, their tormentor, their living god was suddenly just a body growing cold under silk sheets. In that moment, the army faced a terror greater than any enemy. The realization that without Alexander's voice to command them, they were no longer conquerors, just lost men, impossibly far from home. How do you mourn someone who was both your greatest glory and your deepest wound? The answers would fracture the empire within weeks, but in those first raw hours, the soldiers could only do what they'd always done: stand together, waiting for orders that would never come. The news spread through Babylon's streets like a brushfire whispers at first, then wails that echoed off the palace walls. Alexander was dead. Soldiers who'd faced charging elephants without flinching now stood frozen, their hands trembling around spear shafts. Some dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the dusty ground as if the earth itself could swallow their grief. Others lashed out, smashing fists against walls, screaming curses at the gods who dared to claim him. A veteran of a dozen campaigns was seen cradling his helmet like a child, tears cutting tracks through years of grime. "Who leads us now?" he kept repeating, voice ragged. It was the question haunting every tent, every fireside huddle. Without Alexander's voice, his presence, his uncanny ability to turn chaos into order, the army felt unmoored, a ship adrift in a storm they'd once commanded. Disbelief gave way to raw panic. Men who'd crossed deserts and scaled mountains together now eyed each other with suspicion. Would the Persians revolt? Would rival generals carve up the empire like a feast? The rank and file clustered around campfires, swapping rumors in hushed tones. Some swore Alexander had been poisoned by his own officers. Others whispered of omens, a comet seen weeks earlier, a flock of ravens that had circled the palace for days. Even the most hardened skeptics found themselves glancing skyward, half expecting the gods to offer an explanation. The funeral pyre burned for 7 days, its smoke staining the Babylonian sky. Soldiers filed past Alexander's gilded bier, many leaving offerings: a dagger, a lock of hair, a child's wooden toy brought from some distant homeland. These weren't just tokens of respect, they were silent pleas for protection in a world suddenly stripped of its compass. The Macedonians had followed Alexander to the edge of the known world, trusting he'd lead them back. Now, with his body cooling under layers of spices and gold, that trust curdled into something darker. Chaos erupted before the embers had cooled. Generals who'd once bowed to Alexander's will now jockeyed for power, dividing his empire like gamblers splitting a dead man's purse. Ptolemy secured Egypt, Seleucus claimed Babylon, Craterus angled for Macedonia itself. The soldiers watched numb as the unity they'd bled for fractured into a dozen squabbling factions. Veterans who'd survived Gorgamela and Hydaspes now found themselves bargaining for their worth, their loyalty auctioned to the highest bidder. The brotherhood of the phalanx, forged over a decade of shared suffering, unraveled in weeks. In the end, the greatest tragedy wasn't Alexander's death. It was the unmaking of everything he'd built. The empire that had stretched from Greece to India became a patchwork of rival kingdoms, each rewriting history to suit their new masters. The soldiers who'd crossed rivers and mountains as one now scattered to the winds, carrying fragments of the same story, each version a little more fractured than the last. Some returned to Macedonia, their pockets heavy with gold but their hearts hollow. Others stayed in the east, marrying local women, trading armor for plows, their scars the only testament to the world they'd helped create and the world they'd lost. And so the army that had once moved as a single beast, its will bent to Alexander's vision, dissolved into memory. What remained wasn't the glory of conquest, but the quiet resilience of men who'd outlived their purpose. They'd followed a comet, only to be left blinking in the sudden dark. The empire Alexander built with Macedonian blood and Persian gold crumbled before his funeral pyre had even cooled. The soldiers who'd followed him to the ends of the earth now found themselves pawns in a brutal game played by his generals men history would call the Diadocchi, the successors. Overnight, comrades who'd shared rations in the Hindu Kush became mortal enemies, their loyalties divided between Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Babylon, and Antigonus in Asia Minor. Veterans who'd once marched under a single banner now faced each other across battlefields with a grim familiarity, recognizing old drill commands shouted in the same Macedonian dialect. The sarissa that had been their pride now felt heavier in their hands, its weight a reminder of the dream they'd been promised, a united world now splintered beyond repair. For the rank and file, the wars of the Diadocchi were a waking nightmare of shifting allegiances. 1 month you might be swearing oaths to Perdiccas. the next watching his mutilated body dragged through camp by mutinous troops. Paymasters changed faces faster than the seasons, each new general minting coins with his own likeness while backpay went unpaid. A soldier's graffiti scratched onto a Babylonian tablet captures the exhaustion, fought for Antigonus yesterday. Today they say I belong to Lysimachus, tomorrow only the fates know. The very men who'd conquered Persia now bartered their skills like mercenaries, their loyalty measured in silver tetradrachms rather than ideals. The human cost was staggering. At the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, veterans who'd survived Gorgamela and Hydaspes fell by the thousands, not to foreign arrows but to the spears of their own countrymen. Ancient sources describe the surreal horror of Macedonian phalanxes colliding, their identical battle cries merging into a dissonant roar. Some hesitated at the last moment, recognizing faces across the killing zone. Others fought with a fury born of betrayal, as if destroying their mirrored opponents could somehow erase the pain of fractured brotherhood. Amid the chaos, a bitter truth took root. The empire they'd bled for existed only in Alexander's mind. The Diadocchi cared not for cultural fusion or lofty ideals, just land, gold, and the intoxicating rush of power. Ptolemy wrapped himself in Egyptian tradition, posing as a pharaoh. Seleucus adopted the ornate robes of Babylonian kings. The veterans watched, disillusioned, as the very foreign customs Alexander had been crucified for embracing were now wielded as tools of control by men who'd once scorned them. Yet even in this maelstrom, glimmers of the old spirit survived. At the Siege of Rhodes, aging Macedonians on both sides reportedly called temporary truces to share wine and stories of their youth under Alexander. In the muddy trenches outside Babylon, a group of soldiers from rival armies banded together to protect a village from looting, their shared discipline overriding the squabbles of generals. These fleeting moments revealed the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of their shared past bonds that no civil war could fully erase. By the time the dust settled, the empire lay in fragments, but the soldiers' legacy endured in unexpected ways. Their drills became the foundation of Hellenistic warfare. Their hybrid armor designs spread from Greece to India. More profoundly, the children they'd fathered with Persian, Egyptian, and Bactrian women would grow up speaking a blend of tongues, their very existence a living testament to the cultural fusion Alexander had envisioned. The dream of unity died on the battlefields of the Diadocchi, but the seeds planted by those weary veterans would quietly take root in the cracks between kingdoms, waiting centuries to blossom. And so the men who'd crossed rivers and mountains at Alexander's command became the unwitting architects of a new world, not through conquest, but through the quiet persistence of their lives, their loves, and the stories they carried like hidden treasure. Their true victory wasn't in the battles they won, but in the indelible mark they left on the tapestry of history, one frayed thread at a time. For the soldiers who survived Alexander's campaigns, the end of the march was just the beginning of another journey, one without maps or battle formations to guide them. Some returned to Macedonia, their knapsacks heavy with Persian gold but their hearts heavier still. These men walked through the same olive groves they'd left as boys, now strangers in their own villages. Their stories of elephant charges and desert crossings sounded like myths to neighbors who'd never ventured beyond the next valley. One veteran's tombstone, unearthed near Pella, bears a simple epitaph: "I saw the world. It cost me everything, others never made it home." Thousands settled in the cities Alexander had founded: Alexandria in Egypt, Bucephala on the Jhelum, Herat in modern-day Afghanistan. These weren't just garrisons, they were melting pots where grizzled Macedonian spearmen married Persian and Bactrian women, their children speaking a patchwork of languages. Archaeologists digging in Ai Khanum, a Hellenistic city in northern Afghanistan, found a soldier's house with Greek-style frescoes alongside local pottery. In the courtyard, someone had scratched a line from Homer into the plaster, a haunting reminder of a homeland now impossibly distant. The most revealing discoveries come from humble objects. A veteran's grave in Turkmenistan contained his spearhead, rusted but still lethal, buried alongside a tiny clay horse, perhaps a toy for the son he'd never see grow up. In Egypt, papyrus records show retired soldiers leasing farmland, their names now spelled with Egyptian hieroglyphs beside the Greek. These weren't conquerors lording over subjects. They were men putting down roots in soil they'd once marched across as invaders. Yet the past clung to them like armor they couldn't remove. A Babylonian tablet lists payments to Macedonians with no kin, men too broken by war to start families. Other records tell of veterans gathering in taverns, toasting Alexander's memory with wine that tasted increasingly bitter with each passing year. The king who'd promised them glory was now a ghost, and the world they'd built with their sweat and blood was fracturing under his squabbling generals. Modern historians piece together these lives like detectives reconstructing a shattered vase. Isotope analysis of bones reveals which soldiers grew up drinking Macedonian water before spending their final years along the Indus. Lingering traces of pollen in graves tell us who was buried with flowers from their homeland, olive branches pressed into the hands of the dead, a last whisper of Greece carried across continents. Every scrap of evidence whispers the same question: were these men heroes, victims, or something in between? The answer depends on where you look. In Uzbekistan, villagers still point to a crumbling watchtower they call Iskandar's Wall, attributing it to Alexander's veterans, though archaeologists date it centuries later. In Greece, folk songs conflate the soldiers' journeys with Odysseus' wanderings, blurring history into myth. Their true legacy lies not in stone monuments, but in the DNA of millions across Central Asia, the Greek words that slipped into Persian and Sanskrit, and the unbroken line of storytellers who still wonder what it cost those men to stand at the edge of the known world and step beyond. Beneath the shifting sands of modern Iraq and the rocky plains of northern Afghanistan, archaeologists brush away centuries to reveal the faces of Alexander's army. A grave near the ancient city of Gaugamela holds the skeleton of a man in his 30s, his bones still marked by the telltale grooves of muscle attachments built from years of wielding a sarissa. Beside him lies a corroded iron spearhead and a small clay lamp, perhaps meant to light his way in the afterlife. These aren't just relics, they're silent witnesses to lives history books overlook. Scientists use every tool at their disposal to distinguish Macedonian soldiers from the locals they fought and lived among. Isotope analysis of teeth reveals where a man drank water as a child. Macedonia's limestone-rich springs leave a distinct chemical signature compared to the Tigris or Indus River valleys. Skeletal injuries tell their own stories. The distinctive pari fracture on forearm, bones from blocking blows, or the asymmetrical shoulder wear from decades of holding a heavy shield. One skeleton discovered in Uzbekistan even shows signs of trepanation, a crude skull surgery likely attempted to relieve battle-induced swelling. The patient didn't survive, but the effort speaks volumes about the desperation of camp medicine. Personal effects paint intimate portraits. A bronze helmet dredged from the Tigris bears a soldier's name scratched inside the brim liges of Pella, along with a doodle of a laughing satyr. In Egypt, a cache of letters written on papyrus pleads for news from home. If you've planted the north field, send word with Thales the shipmaster, and kiss the boy for me. These fragments humanize men reduced to casualty counts in ancient chronicles. Yet for all these discoveries, archaeology also exposes the gaps in our knowledge. A mass grave near Sidon holds skeletons with both Macedonian weapon injuries and Persian arrowheads lodged in their ribs. Were they deserters executed by their own side? Allies caught in friendly fire, the soil keeps its secrets. What's clear is that every shard of pottery, every rusted buckle, forces us to reconsider the simplistic tropes of conquerors and conquered. The real challenge comes when we compare these physical remains to the written records. Ancient historians like Arrian and Plutarch had agendas: to flatter Roman patrons, to moralize about leadership, to weave epic narratives. Their accounts overflow with speeches and strategies but often ignore the grunt work of war. The dysentery outbreaks, the homesick graffiti on barracks walls, the Persian wives who taught their Macedonian husbands to cook with saffron. Archaeology gives voice to these silent stories, but it also reveals how deeply bias shapes what survives. Next, we'll confront the uncomfortable truth about the historical record, how victors' narratives erased inconvenient realities, and why the dirt beneath our feet often tells a more honest story than the scrolls preserved in libraries. Plutarch's biographies paint Alexander in strokes so golden they nearly blind us to the men standing in his shadow. The historian's famous line, "Alexander's ambition was a fire that consumed the world," ignores the thousands of hands that fed that fire, the soldiers who marched until their sandals disintegrated, who held formations with spears trembling from exhaustion. Ancient chroniclers had agendas. For Plutarch, writing under Rome's gaze centuries after Alexander's death, the king was less a man than a moral lesson, a paragon of leadership whose flaws could be smoothed like marble under a chisel. His soldiers footnotes in an epic. This glorification wasn't accidental. Royal propaganda shaped histories from the start. Alexander's court historian, Callisthenes, described the army's grueling trek through the Gedrosian desert as a heroic trial orchestrated by the king, omitting the fact that thousands perished from his miscalculation. Later writers amplified this myth-making. Arrian, relying on lost accounts by Alexander's generals, framed every decision as strategic genius, even the drunken murder of Cleitus. The message was clear: kings make history, soldiers merely inhabit it. Archaeology whispers a different story. A mass grave near modern-day Tyre holds skeletons with Macedonian-style spear wounds, but also Persian arrowheads embedded in their backs. Were these men cut down while retreating? Historians silent on the subject would never admit such weakness in Alexander's ranks. Even the famed peaceful blending of cultures falls under scrutiny. Cuneiform tablets from Babylon record complaints about Macedonian soldiers seizing homes, contradicting rosy narratives of voluntary integration. The greatest distortion lies in what wasn't recorded. No surviving account mentions the Macedonian infantryman who carved his wife's name into his shield, or the Thracian archer who traded his rations for a Persian child's lost doll. These human moments, the desertions, the bartered friendships, the quiet acts of mercy slipped through history's sieve. What might those soldiers have written if given the chance? A handful of tantalizing clues survive. A scrap of papyrus from Egypt bearing a veteran's plea for back pay. A Babylonian clay tablet with a doodle of a laughing soldier beside the words, 10 years and still alive. These fractured voices hint at a truth no court historian would dare commit to parchment: that conquest was as much about blistered feet and homesick whispers as it was about glory. Perhaps the most damning evidence of bias lies in what ancient historians considered unworthy of mention. Plutarch devotes pages to Alexander taming Bucephalus, but glosses over the king's order to execute thousands of Tyrian prisoners after their city fell. The silence is deafening. It makes you wonder, if these accounts were written by the rank and file, would we be reading about tactical brilliance or the way blood turns cold on a spear shaft when you realize the man you killed was someone's father. The next time you read an ancient chronicle, listen for the gaps between the lines. Behind every grand speech attributed to Alexander, there were 1,000 untold conversations around campfires, words that history has buried but not erased. History remembers the words of kings and generals, but the voices of Alexander's common soldiers have been reduced to whispers in the wind. While Ptolemy and Aristobulus wrote memoirs, and court historians like Callisthenes chronicled the king's every gesture, the men who formed the backbone of the phalanx left no diaries, no grand treatises. Their stories survive only in fragments, a name scratched on a shield, a plea for back pay scribbled on papyrus, a tombstone with 3 lines of grief. The irony is crushing. The very men who marched thousands of miles, who held the line at Gaugamela and gasped through the Gedrosian sands, remain the least heard in their own story. The silence wasn't accidental. Ancient societies viewed history as the domain of the elite, a stage where only the high-born deserved soliloquies. Literacy among Macedonian foot soldiers was rare, and even those who could write seldom had the time or means to record their experiences. Imagine a veteran crouched by a campfire, calloused fingers fumbling with a wax tablet. Why would he document his life when every ounce of energy went into surviving the next march? Meanwhile, officers like Ptolemy had scribes at their disposal, their accounts polished for posterity. The result is a history written by the victors about the victors, with the rank and file relegated to background noise. But archaeology offers glimpses through the cracks. A potsherd found near Babylon bears a soldier's crude drawing of a charging elephant, its trunk curled in terror, perhaps the work of a man trying to explain the unimaginable to loved ones back home. In Egypt, a papyrus fragment preserves a veteran's plea to his brother. "Send wool for my cloak, the nights here are cold as Hades." These fleeting echoes humanize the faceless masses of the phalanx, reminding us that for every grand speech Alexander delivered, there were 10,000 private conversations we'll never hear. The rarest exceptions are treasures. The so-called Alexander Romance, a later compilation of legends, contains snippets of soldiers' folktales, how they mistook rhinoceros hides for dragon scales, or believed the Hindu Kush's echoes were ghostly voices. More revealing is a Babylonian astronomical diary, an otherwise dry record of planetary movements, which notes in passing how Macedonian troops traded their rations for dates and sesame oil during a supply shortage. Such mundane details, accidental inclusions in someone else's narrative, become precious windows into the daily grind of conquest, yet even these fragments come filtered through someone else's lens. The true loss isn't just the absence of soldiers' words, it's the distortion of their reality. When Arrian describes the army cheering Alexander's speech at Opis, we don't hear the muttered dissent, the exhausted sighs of men who'd stopped believing in speeches. What did they talk about when no historians were listening? The homesickness, the blisters, the dread of the next river crossing. The answers lie buried deeper than any spade can reach. But just when the silence feels absolute, a discovery startles us back to hope. In 2014, archaeologists excavating a Macedonian outpost in Afghanistan uncovered a handful of lead tablets. Etched in clumsy Greek were voting token soldiers' ballots on disciplinary matters. One reads simply, "Guilty, but he was hungry." In that spare phrase, we hear it at last, the voice of the common man weighing mercy against survival, leaving his mark on history in 6 raw words. It's proof that even in the shadows of empire, the ordinary found ways to speak. Their words may be scarce, but their presence lingers like dust kicked up from a march that never truly ended. A crude carving on a temple wall in Egypt stops you cold. Not the elegant hieroglyphs of pharaohs, but rough Greek letters gouged into stone. Dionysios was here, and he misses his mother. This simple graffiti, scratched by a Macedonian soldier over 2,000 years ago, cuts through the grand narratives of conquest to reveal something far more human. Across the ruins of Alexander's empire, these fragments endure whispers of ordinary men caught in the tide of history. A shield boss dredged from the Tigris bears the inscription for Heracle's protection, the letters worn smooth by anxious thumbs rubbing them during battle. In a cave near the Hindu Kush, charcoal marks spell out a tally of marching days beside a doodle of a woman's face, her features blurred by time but her presence achingly real to the homesick hand that drew her. These aren't just artifacts, they're emotional time capsules. A pottery shard from Babylon preserves a soldier's desperate plea. Liges to his brother, send more wine, the local stuff tastes like goat piss. The humor masks deeper truths, the longing for familiar comforts, the alienation in foreign lands. More poignant still are votive offerings found at makeshift roadside shrines. A tiny lead figurine of a horseman left with the scratched prayer, "Bring me home alive," its surface polished by fingers clinging to hope. Even the weapons tell stories. One Sarissa spearhead discovered near Gorgamla has Philota's love's ties, etched near the socket, a battlefield romance immortalized in steel. The contrast between these raw, personal expressions and the polished accounts of historians couldn't be starker. While Plutarch waxes poetic about Alexander's divine ambitions, a bronze helmet liner from Susa whispers a darker truth: the king led us into hell. The water was gone, and so was Cleitos, the vultures grew fat. This unfiltered voice, free from royal propaganda, exposes the gulf between leadership's glory and the grunt's reality. Modern media often misses this duality. Hollywood paints Alexander's soldiers either as faceless killing machines or noble patriots, ignoring the complexity these inscriptions reveal. The blockbuster film Alexander reduced them to shouting extras, while video games like Total War turned their suffering into tactical abstractions. Yet occasionally, a flicker of authenticity breaks through, like the haunting soldier's chant in the Rome TV series, "Jupiter's cock, we're still here." That crude, exhausted defiance comes closer to the truth than 1,000 textbook heroics. What emerges from these fragments is neither myth nor propaganda, but something far more compelling: the unfiltered humanity of men who are neither saints nor monsters, just weary travelers on history's long road. Their words, scratched in desperation or devotion, remind us that the real story of conquest wasn't written in palaces or battle plans, but in the quiet moments between marches, when a man reached for a knife to carve his truth into the world before it forgot him. Hollywood loves a conqueror, but it often forgets the conquered, and the very men who did the conquering. Take Oliver Stone's Alexander, where Colin Farrell's golden locks and brooding speeches dominate the screen, while his soldiers fade into a sea of interchangeable helmets. The film's battle scenes are spectacles of choreographed chaos, but where's the grit, the exhaustion? The Macedonian recruit who pukes behind his shield before his first charge. It's a common flaw. Epic films reduce history's backbone to props, their stories drowned out by trumpets and CGI. Video games don't fare much better. Total War, Rome Roman 2 lets you command phalanxes with a mouse click, abstracting human suffering into health bars and morale meters. The soldiers scream scripted lines, but their individuality vanishes the moment you zoom out. Rare exceptions stand out. Assassin's Creed Odyssey includes a minor quest where you help a veteran retrieve his stolen armor, a fleeting nod to the personal stakes behind the gear. Even rarer is Expeditions, Rome, where a wounded legionary mutters, "I used to farm olives," reminding players that every sword was once a plowshare. Why this erasure? Perhaps because soldiers' truths are messy. Films want heroism, games need playable mechanics. Neither has room for the Macedonian who deserted to protect his sister's dowry, or the Thracian who painted his lover's name inside his shield. Yet when authenticity breaks through, it's electrifying. The Rome TV series nailed it with Pullo's raw terror mid-battle, no glory, just a man praying his bowels don't betray him. Or The Lost Army, a novel where a spearman's blistered hands and homesick dreams take center stage. The deeper issue isn't just accuracy, it's empathy. Reducing these men to faceless units lets us ignore the cost of empire. What if we saw the Persian boy who bandaged a Macedonian's wound, only to die by his spear years later? Or the Indian monsoon that rusted armor while fever claimed more lives than combat? These aren't details, they're the heart of the story. Pop culture's blind spot reveals an uncomfortable truth: we prefer myths to men. Alexander's soldiers deserve more than extras roles. They deserve to be remembered not as conquerors but as people. And that's the real battle history still fights. Alexander's army became a living, breathing crossroads of cultures, a place where Greek met Persian, where Macedonian war cries blended with Bactrian chants. This wasn't just a military force, it was history's first great experiment in globalization, a chaotic, vibrant mixing of languages, gods, and traditions. Picture a campfire on the banks of the Oxus River. A grizzled Macedonian veteran shares wine with a Sogdian horseman, both struggling to communicate through gestures and broken phrases, while a Babylonian scribe nearby scratches notes in Greek script. These weren't just chance encounters, they were the birth pangs of a new world. The most visible fusion happened in marriages, after the mass wedding at Susa, where Alexander and 80 of his officers took Persian brides. Rank-and-file soldiers followed suit. Tombstones in modern-day Afghanistan reveal Macedonian names paired with local women: Leon of Pella, husband of Roxana of Bactria. These unions weren't just political, they were practical. A soldier stationed in Egypt might marry a local weaver to secure cloth for his comrades, while a cavalryman in Babylon wed a baker's daughter to ensure fresh bread. Love sometimes flourished in the cracks between necessity and strategy. Archaeologists find poignant evidence. A grave in Turkmenistan holds a skeleton wearing a Greek-style cloak pinned with a Persian brooch, its garnet stones cut in a hybrid design unseen before Alexander's march. Hybrid customs emerged organically from these unions. Macedonian soldiers adopted Persian trousers for desert marches, while their new wives learned to weave Greek-style tunics. Religious practices blurred. A votive plaque found near the Indus shows Heracles wearing an elephant skin cloak, his club resting beside an Indian trident. Even cooking pots tell stories. Excavations at Ai Khanum reveal kitchens where olive oil bubbled alongside sesame paste, where soldiers' wives seasoned lamb with cumin instead of thyme. These weren't compromises, they were inventions born from the daily grind of survival in foreign lands. Language became its own battlefield and bridge. Official orders went out in Greek, but the barracks buzzed with a pidgin of Macedonian slang, Persian courtesies, and local curse words. A pottery shard from Egypt bears a shopping list written in Greek letters but Persian vocabulary: 2 cups of dug, 1 sack of berenj. The army's scribes, tasked with record-keeping, became accidental linguists, inventing new alphabets to transcribe Bactrian place names or Indian trade terms. This linguistic stew didn't just facilitate trade. It allowed a Thracian archer to barter with a Hindu blacksmith, or a Syrian medic to explain wound care to a Macedonian infantryman. The cultural exchange flowed both ways. As Greek drama spread to Babylon's theaters, local musicians taught Macedonians to play the double flute. Persian irrigation techniques revived parched Greek farmsteads in Mesopotamia, while Indian medics introduced Greeks to the healing power of turmeric. Even children's toys show the blend. A clay horse from Taxila has the realistic mane of a Greek sculptor's model, but the painted stripes of a Persian stallion. These weren't conquerors imposing their ways, they were neighbors borrowing, adapting, and creating something entirely new. Yet this melting pot had its tensions. Veterans grumbled when Alexander demanded they bow like Persians, and local priests resented Greek sacrifices in their temples. A cuneiform tablet from Babylon complains about Macedonian soldiers defiling sacred groves with wine-soaked revels. The irony was thick. The same army that spread Greek culture also diluted it, blending it beyond recognition. By the time Alexander died, his dream of Hellenizing the world had birthed something stranger, a patchwork civilization where a man might pray to Zeus Ammon in the morning, eat Persian stew at noon, and dance to Bactrian flutes by night. This cultural alchemy shaped history more than any battle. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged weren't just Greek outposts, they were laboratories of fusion, where Euclid's geometry met Indian astronomy, where Buddhist monks debated Stoic philosophers. The Silk Road's vibrant exchange, the scientific leaps of Alexandria's library, even the artistic revolution that gave us the Gandhara Buddhas, all grew from the seeds planted by those rough-edged soldiers and their unlikely families. The true conquest wasn't of land, but of imagination, proving that culture, like water, always finds its own level. The dusty outposts where Alexander's veterans planted their spears and built homes became the unexpected nurseries of a new world. Take Alexandria in Egypt, founded as a strategic port, but transformed within decades into a bustling crossroads where Greek philosophers debated in shaded colonnades, while Egyptian artisans adapted Hellenistic motifs into their hieroglyphs. This wasn't just a city, it was a living fusion, its very streets echoing with the hybrid accents of Macedonian soldiers, Phoenician traders, and Nubian builders. The veterans who settled there didn't just bring their armor, they carried dialects, recipes, and gods, blending them with local traditions until something entirely new emerged. A pottery shard found near the ancient harbor bears a child's scrawl in Greek letters. "My father says we're from Pella, but my mother sings me Nile lullabies." These soldier colonists became accidental ambassadors. In Bactria, retired cavalrymen taught local farmers to graft Macedonian grapevines onto hardy mountain roots, birthing a wine trade that thrived for centuries. Along the Indus, veterans' workshops produced hybrid art, statues of Buddha draped in Greek-style robes, their curls echoing Apollo's. Even the coins told a story. Silver drachmas minted in Afghanistan bore the face of King Eucratides on one side, Greek style, but flip it over, and you'd find Hindu deities alongside Greek inscriptions. This cultural alchemy didn't happen in palaces or lecture halls. It bubbled up from the daily lives of men who'd marched across continents and chose to stay. Language spread like wildfire through these veteran communities. A scrap of papyrus from a Roman-era Egyptian trash heap reveals a shocking detail. A Macedonian grandmother's will, dictated in Greek but notarized by a scribe who spelled her hometown, Pella, in Demotic script. Over time, these linguistic collisions birthed Koine Greek, the common tongue that would later carry Christianity across the Mediterranean. The soldiers' slang, words picked up from Persian bazaars or Indian ports, seeped into local dialects. To this day, Pashto speakers in Afghanistan use a word for helmet that traces back to the Macedonian chronos, a linguistic fossil preserved by some long-dead veterans' children. Yet the most lasting legacy wasn't in art or language, but in the DNA of ideas. The veterans' mixed-race children grew up straddling worlds, their very existence challenging old prejudices. In Seleucid Syria, Greco-Persian families produced scholars who merged Zoroastrian cosmology with Aristotelian logic. In Ptolemaic Egypt, hybrid temples enshrined Serapis, a god crafted to resemble Zeus but with the quiet wisdom of Osiris. This cultural fluidity, born from the grit of soldier settlers, laid groundwork for the cosmopolitanism that would define the Silk Road and beyond. What makes their story resonate today isn't just the scale of their influence, but its intimacy. Every time archaeologists uncover a child's toy, a wooden horse with both Greek carvings and Persian paint, we're reminded that history's grandest transformations often begin around kitchen fires and market stalls. These men didn't set out to reshape civilizations. They simply lived, loved, and adapted, leaving behind a world far richer for their unintended revolutions. So what can their journeys teach us in an age of clashing cultures and fractured identities? Perhaps that the most enduring conquests aren't won with spears, but with the quiet courage to plant roots in foreign soil and let them grow. 2,000 years may separate Alexander's phalanx from today's armored battalions, but the echoes between their worlds are uncanny. A Macedonian veteran startling awake at the clatter of a dropped shield isn't so different from a modern soldier flinching at a car backfire, both haunted by a body that refuses to forget war's soundtrack. Hippocrates called it soldier's heart, the Romans labeled it nostalgia, but we recognize it now as the same invisible wound, post-traumatic stress. The scrolls of ancient physicians describe treatments eerily familiar: music therapy for anxiety, communal storytelling to ease nightmares, proof that trauma's roots run deeper than gunpowder or steel. Camaraderie too transcends centuries. The way Alexander's men divided their last sips of vinegar water mirrors the ritual of modern squads sharing care package snacks in forward bases. A Babylonian tablet records two soldiers pooling coins to buy a wounded comrade's freedom, while a Vietnam veteran's memoir recounts carrying a buddy for miles through monsoon rains. That unbreakable bond forged in shared suffering is war's one constant, whether the weapons are sarissas or smart rifles. Even military humor crosses millennia. A graffito in a Persian barracks shows a crude sketch of an officer with donkey ears, captioned, "The General Knows Best," a joke that wouldn't feel out of place scrawled on a porta potty in Afghanistan. Yet some contrasts are stark. Alexander's troops marched without GPS or antibiotics, their survival hinging on stars and superstition. Today's soldiers video call home from war zones, their trauma compounded by the whiplash between battlefield grit and domestic small talk. But perhaps the most poignant parallel lies in homecomings. An Athenian ceramic shard depicts a veteran struggling to hold a plow, his hands still shaped for a spear, just as modern warriors relearn civilian rhythms, their instincts lagging behind peacetime's pace. This thread through time reminds us that behind every helmet, whether bronze or Kevlar, beats a human heart. The landscapes of war change, but its fingerprints on the soul do not. Which brings us full circle to where we began, not with battle plans or borders, but with the men who carried them on their shoulders. From the dust of Gaugamela to the sands of Fallujah, the true cost of conquest isn't measured in territory taken, but in the quiet toll exacted on those who do the taking. Their stories, separated by centuries but united by experience, whisper a truth as old as combat itself, that every victory leaves scars and every empire is built on the backs of ordinary souls pushed to extraordinary limits. The true measure of Alexander's empire wasn't just in the miles it spanned, but in the cracked hands and scarred backs of the men who built it. They marched until their sandals disintegrated, fought until their spears splintered, and held formations through blizzards and sandstorms, their loyalty tested by thirst, mutiny, and the slow erosion of hope. These weren't just soldiers, they were the living sinew that held Alexander's ambitions together, the unbreakable thread stitching Greece to India. For every statue erected in the king's honor, there were 10,000 untold stories of men who whispered their children's names into campfire smoke, who traded rations with enemies turned brothers, who buried friends in unmarked graves along forgotten roads. Their legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places, in the DNA of modern Afghanistan, where descendants still carry Macedonian genetic markers, in the ruins of Ai Khanum, where a soldier's graffiti, "I was here," etches his presence into eternity. In the hybrid art of Gandhara, where Buddha's serene face bears the chisel marks of Greek sculptors, these men didn't just conquer, they connected, blending cultures with every marriage, every shared meal, every borrowed word that slipped into common speech. The empire they built with their sweat outlasted Alexander's lifetime, not because of his genius alone, but because they planted pieces of themselves in the soil of every land they crossed. Yet history's spotlight rarely finds them. We know Alexander's speeches by heart, but what of the veteran who carved his wife's name into his shield before Gaugamela, the medic who boiled herbs in a dented helmet to ease a fever? The Persian boy who bandaged a Macedonian's wound only to die by his spear years later. These are the ghosts that haunt the margins of our textbooks, their voices drowned out by the fanfare of kings. As historian Robin Lane Fox reminds us, the forgotten are the mortar between history's bricks. Without them, the entire edifice crumbles. So the next time you marvel at Alexander's conquests, look past the gilded statues and sweeping battle maps. See instead the blistered feet that made those journeys possible, the calloused hands that held the line when empires trembled. These men were more than instruments of war, they were fathers, farmers, and fugitives from poverty, bound together by circumstance and the unshakable will to survive. Their story isn't just a footnote, it's the beating heart of history itself. Now it's your turn. Whose untold story from history's shadows fascinates you? Share your thoughts on these unsung heroes below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries time almost forgot. After all, the past isn't just about the names we remember, it's about the voices we've yet